Have you ever watched someone you love, maybe a parent or a grandparent, and noticed they just don't seem like themselves anymore? Maybe they're quieter than usual, or they're not getting around quite as easily as they once did. It's tough to think about, isn't it? As we get older, or as we care for the seniors in our lives, it's natural to wonder what those little changes might mean. Sometimes they're just part of aging, nothing to lose sleep over, but other times they could be gentle whispers, little clues that someone might be entering their final year. Today, I want to walk with you through something really important. 5 subtle signs that could mean an elderly person is nearing the end of their journey. These aren't loud alarms or big red flags, but quiet shifts you might notice if you're paying attention. Knowing what to look for can help you be there for them in the best way possible, whether that's offering comfort, making memories, or just sitting with them a little longer. Now, I'm not here to scare you or make you feel down. This is about understanding, about being ready, and about cherishing the time we have. We're going to take this step by step, and I'll share some stories along the way to make it feel real, because it is real. Life is beautiful, even in its harder moments, and being aware can help us make the most of it. So, let's start with the first sign. Something you might not think much of at first, but it can tell us a lot. A change in how much energy they've got. You know how you used to see your mom bustling around the kitchen, whipping up her famous apple pie, or your dad tinkering in the garage for hours without a break? That energy, that spark, it's something we take for granted until it starts to fade. One of the earliest signs that someone might be in their final year is when their get up and go just isn't there anymore. It's not just being tired after a long day. It's a deeper kind of exhaustion. Maybe they're sleeping more during the day, nodding off in their favorite chair when they never used to. Or they're skipping things they once loved, like a morning walk or tending to their flowers, because it feels like too much. I remember my Aunt Clara, who was the life of every family gathering. She'd be the first one up, making coffee for everyone, laughing and telling stories. But in her last year, she started saying things like, "Oh, I'll just sit this one out," or she'd doze off mid-conversation. At first, we thought she was just having an off day, but it kept happening. That shift in energy was her body's way of slowing down, of telling us it was getting ready to rest. It's not always obvious, though. Some folks hide it well. They don't want to worry you. So, you might need to look a little closer. Are they taking longer to get out of bed? Do they seem winded after something simple, like walking to the mailbox? If you're noticing this, don't panic. It doesn't always mean the end is near, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Maybe even chatting with their doctor if it feels off. The best thing you can do is be there. Sit with them. Let them rest when they need to. Don't push them to snap out of it. That quiet time together can mean more than you know. Now, energy's one thing, but what about how they're eating? That brings us to the second sign. Changes in appetite or weight that sneak up on you. Think about it. Food is life, right? It's comfort. It's joy. It's how we connect. But when someone's body starts winding down, that relationship with food can shift. Maybe they're not hungry like they used to be, or they're picking at their plate when they'd normally clean it. I saw this with my neighbor, Mr. Jim. He was a big guy, loved his steak and potatoes, and he'd always brag about finishing every bite. But over a few months, he started saying things like, "I'm just not in the mood," or "That's too much for me." He dropped weight fast. His shirts hung loose, and his face looked thinner. We didn't realize it then, but it was one of those subtle warnings. Sometimes it's not just less eating. It could be trouble swallowing, or they're losing interest in flavors they used to love. It's heartbreaking to watch, especially if you're the one cooking for them, trying to Tempt them with their favorites. But here's what you can do. Don't force it. Offer small, easy bites, maybe some soup or a little piece of fruit, and see what they're up for. Keep it light, keep it loving. And if the weight's dropping fast or they're not eating at all, that's when you might want to loop in a doctor or a nurse. It's not about fixing it, it's about making them comfortable. So, we've talked about energy fading and appetite changing, and those can feel heavy to think about. But there's more to this, and it's just as important. Let's move into how they're moving, or maybe how they're not moving as much anymore. That's where we'll pick up next. So, we've been talking about how energy can slip away and how appetite might start to fade. And those are big clues if you're watching closely. But now, let's think about something else you might notice, how they're getting around. Movement is one of those things we don't think about until it changes, and when it does, it can tell us a lot. The third sign that an elderly person might be in their final year is a shift in their mobility, those little struggles that start to pile up. Maybe they're not walking as steady as they used to, or they're holding on to furniture when they move across the room. It's not just a stiff knee or a sore back. It's deeper, like their body's saying, I'm not up for this anymore. I think of my Uncle Ray when this comes to mind. He was never one to sit still, always out mowing the lawn or fixing something around the house. But in that last year, I'd catch him pausing at the stairs, gripping the railing a little tighter, or he'd shuffle instead of stride. One day, he just stopped going upstairs altogether, said it wasn't worth the trouble. At first, we chalked it up to age, but it was more than that. His legs weren't keeping up, and he'd get this tired look, like every step took something out of him. That's what you might see. More time in the chair, less time on their feet, or maybe they're reaching for a cane they swore they'd never use. It's not always dramatic, though. Sometimes it's subtle, taking longer to stand up, or they're wobbly when they do. You might hear them say, I'll get to it later, when they never used to put things off. And here's the thing, it's not just about the body. When movement slows down, it can pull them inward, less chatting with neighbors, less popping out to the store. It's like their world gets smaller, and that's a sign worth noticing. What can you do? Keep them company where they're at. If they're not up for a walk, sit with them instead. Bring the conversation to them. And if it's getting risky, like they're stumbling a lot, maybe it's time to talk about a walker or a little extra help around the house. It's not about taking away their independence. It's about keeping them safe and close. Now, as their body slows down, something else might shift too. How they're feeling inside. That brings us to the fourth sign, a change in their mood or their spirit. You know how some people just light up a room no matter how old they get? Well, when someone's nearing the end, that light might dim a bit. It's not always depression, though it can look like that. More like a quietness, a pulling back. They might not laugh as quick, or they're not as chatty as they used to be. I remember my grandma who'd tell the wildest stories about her childhood, full of sass and sparkle. But in her last months, she got softer, more thoughtful. She'd stare out the window a lot, and when I'd ask what's on her mind, she'd just smile and say, "Oh, nothing much." It wasn't sadness. It was like she was somewhere else, reflecting maybe, or letting go. You might see this in little ways. They're not as interested in the grandkids' antics, or they skip the family gossip they used to live for. Sometimes it's words, too. They might talk about the past more, or say things like, I've had a good run, out of nowhere. It can catch you off guard, and it's easy to brush it off as a bad day. But if it lingers, if they seem detached or peaceful in a way that's new, it's worth tuning in. What can you do here? Just listen. Sit with them. Ask about those old stories, if they're up for it, or let the silence be okay. It's not about cheering them up. It's about being there, letting them feel what they feel. We've covered a lot: energy, eating, moving, and now mood. And it's all connected, isn't it? These signs weave together, painting a picture of where they're at. But there's one more piece to this, something that ties it all up. And that's what we'll dive into next: how they're sleeping, or maybe how they're not. It's a big one, so let's keep going. We've been walking through this together, talking about how energy fades, appetite shift, movement slows, and moods soften. And it's like piecing together a puzzle, isn't it? Each little change tells us something. And now we're at the fifth sign, one that might seem small, but carries a lot of weight: how they're sleeping. Sleep is such a personal thing. Some folks have always been light sleepers. Others could snooze through a storm. But when someone's nearing their final year, you might notice their sleep patterns doing something different, something that doesn't quite fit who they've been. It could go either way. Maybe they're sleeping way more than usual, or maybe they're barely sleeping at all. And both can be a quiet signal their body's winding down. Take my friend's dad, Pops, for example. He was a night owl his whole life, up late watching old westerns, puttering around the house, but in that last year, he'd be out cold by noon, napping for hours, and then sleeping through the night too. We'd joke he was making up for lost time, but it was more than that. His body was craving rest, like it was storing up for something. On the flip side, I've heard stories of folks who go the other way, wide awake at odd hours, restless, like they can't settle. My cousin's grandpa was like that, up pacing at night, saying he just couldn't get comfortable. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was new, and it stuck with her, whether it's too much sleep or not enough. It's that shift from their norm that's worth noticing. You might see them dozing off in the middle of a chat, or maybe they're up when everyone else is down, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes it's tied to those other signs: less energy to move, less appetite to fuel them. So their body's rhythm gets thrown off. What can you do about it? Not much to fix it, but you can be there. If they're sleeping a lot, let them rest. Keep the house calm. Maybe sit nearby with a book so they know you're close. If they're restless, try a soft talk in the wee hours, or a warm drink if they're up for it. It's about comfort, not control. And if it's really off, like days with no sleep, or they're confused when they wake, maybe check in with someone who knows more, like a nurse or doctor. It's just another way to love them through it. So, here we are. After looking at all these pieces: energy dipping, eating less, moving slower, mood shifting, and now sleep changing. It's not a checklist to tick off. It's more like a story unfolding, one you're part of. These signs aren't a death sentence. Sometimes they're just age doing its thing, and that's okay. But when they start stacking up, when you see a few at once, it's like the universe nudging you to pay attention, to soak up the moments you've got. I think about my Aunt Clara napping in her chair, or Mr. Jim skipping his steak, and it hits me how precious those days were, even the quiet ones. You don't have to fix everything. Just notice, be there, hold space for them. Small things, like a hand on theirs or a shared laugh, stick with you longer than you'd think. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What have you seen in your own life? Maybe you've noticed these signs with someone you care about, or you've got a story that's close to your heart. Drop it in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. If this resonated with you, give it a thumbs up. It helps more folks find it. And hey, stick around. Hit that subscribe button for more down-to-earth talks like this. We're all in this together, figuring out how to live well, no matter the years. Here's to making every day count, at any age. See you next time.